So welcome everybody to the second of 5 planned office hours. These office hours are designed to focus on Zowe V3 for Zowe extenders. I am Rose Sakatch. I lead the onboarding squad, and I will be kicking off this session and probably the ones to follow. Just a quick review about office hours. This series will focus on specific Zowe components to ensure we offer extenders a deeper understanding of V3. Each session is planning to review for each component new features, breaking changes that most likely will impact Zowe extenders, any new conformance criteria, and then when you can begin testing and where to find the technology that you can test with. Office hours is meant to be interactive, so please ask questions along the way. You can post them in the chat. You can, everybody's audio is available. Certainly raise any concerns and offer comments as we go through the specific component. And this week, we will focus on Zowe CLI. However, once we finish the topic and respond to any questions, please feel free to ask any general questions related to V3, and we'll do our best to answer them. And then finally, please reference zowe.org/vnext. This is where we update and continue to update any relevant information related to Zowe V3. And this is definitely a living web page, so we recommend that you go there early and often, as they say. And as of right now, the planned GA date for V3 is March 28, 2024. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to Adam Wolf, who will be talking about Zowe CLI. Over to you, Adam.
Okay, thank you, Rose. So let's dive in. On the agenda today, we'll go over the release timeline, talk about new features, breaking changes, V3 conformance, testing plugins, and then we'll talk about some resources and open it for Q&A. So first, the timeline. So V1 conformance, of course, aligns with V1 LTS, and that will be ending in maintenance ends for V1 in September of 2024. V2 conformance aligns with V2 LTS, and V3 conformance, of course, will align with V3 LTS, and you can see the schedule in this diagram. And we'll dive into new features. And I think it would be good to preface this information with, there are no guarantees here. This is what we're planning at the moment. Plans are subject to change. But so let's dive in. First new feature will be support for multiple API-ML gateways. So when we talk about this, we're talking about allowing a user to have multiple API-ML gateway connections within a single team config file. And why would we want to do this? Well, we want to enable users in a complex environment to easily work between multiple LPARs or sysplexes that exist behind separate API-ML gateways. And the impact to users will be that they'll be able to configure Zowe CLI to authenticate to multiple API-ML instances and work seamlessly among their available mainframe services on those separate instances without having to switch out configuration files or make changes. The impact to extenders will be that plugins will be provided information from a new API-ML profile type. And so extenders that manipulate team configs will have to adapt to the inclusion of the new API-ML profile type within team configs. And next, our plan is to provide a Jenkins file template that will replace the shared library, which can be found at github.com/Zowe CLI version controller. The goal here is to enable extenders to manage their own pipelines. And so the impact to extenders, if they happen to use this shared library, will be that they'll have to develop their own CI/CD pipelines if they don't exist already. And we'll be providing a Jenkins file template as a guide so that they can more easily roll out their own CI/CD pipelines. And we'll move on to breaking changes. The first, and I think the biggest, breaking change will be the removal of V1 profile support. So when we say that, we're talking about functionality related to creating and modifying V1 profiles will be removed from Zowe CLI in V3. Now, the ability to convert existing profiles to team configs is still planned to be included. So a user will be able to move from their V1 profiles into V3 without having to effectively start from a blank slate. Although there are tools, you can use API ML to auto init a config. But still, for users with V1 configs, they'll be able to use the built-in conversion feature that we introduced in V2 to move those V1 configs or V1 profiles to team configs. Why do we want to do this? Well, V1 profiles were deprecated in V2 in favor of the more flexible and portable team config. And so the impact to users is that in order to use Zowe CLI v3, users will have to implement team configs or convert their existing profiles. For extenders, this may not affect many extenders. I think if you use imperative for managing your profiles. But plugins will only be able to use team configs for loading user profiles. And the next one is one that is under consideration. We don't have a definite plan here, but just to give you an idea of what we're considering, this applies to the order that authentication methods are used if a user has multiple authentication methods specified in their team config. So currently, profiles that contain a user ID and password, as well as token authentication, will attempt to authenticate first using the user ID and password. In V3, we're considering having the token take precedence, meaning we'll check for a token first and use that to authenticate to the service in question. So why are we considering this? Well, in cases where a user ID and password have been used to generate a token, it seems logical that once we've generated a token, we would want to use that token instead of the user and password that might be also stored with the profile. The impact to users is that the authentication method used for services may change based on the settings in the user's team config. You know, if they have token authentication, as well as username and password. For extenders, to provide a consistent experience, plugins may need to adjust how they read profile or how they read credentials based on the values stored in the user's profile. And again, this is under consideration. And even if we make the change, it would probably only affect a very small subset of plugins. The next breaking change is the removal of deprecated items. This includes constants, options, methods, and so on. There are really too many to go over in this presentation, I think, but I've included links to the relevant GitHub issues that contain lists of the deprecated items that will be removed in V3. And why? Well, these items were deprecated in V2 and are either redundant or no longer useful. And the impact to extenders is that plugins using previously deprecated items will have to be modified to use alternatives. So if you, I think it would be wise if you have a plugin to just check these lists, make sure that you're not using any of the methods or other items listed. If you are, look for alternatives. If you can't find one, there are ways to reach out to the team, and we'll go over that in the, I think, the resources slide. Now, in terms of new deprecations for V3, well, let's just run through it. So the Zowe perf timing library is a node package used for performance timing. Alternatives exist, I believe, that are more standard for node applications. And I don't think the perf timing library is really used by anybody at this point, and it's not worth maintaining, just considering that there are alternatives out there that probably perform better than perf timing. And so we would advise you to move over to those node libraries. And again, we talked about earlier the shared libraries in the GitHub Zowe or github.com/Zowe/Zowe CLI version controller. And we'll be providing a Jenkins file template to help any plugins that might be using that for publishing. Now, the following items are under consideration for deprecation. These are still an open debate. But number one is the imperative package. So in preparation for V3, we've been moving imperative, the source repository for imperative, into the Zowe CLI repository. However, we've been planning to keep imperative as a separate package on NPM. And what we've done thus far should have no impact on extenders. However, in V4, we're looking at potentially absorbing imperative into the core for Zowe SDK. We're considering this because imperative is essentially a framework for Zowe CLI. As far as I know, no other projects use imperative except for Zowe CLI, Zowe plugins, Zowe Explorer. So it's a very Zowe-centric package. And just logically, it would make more sense for it to be part of Core for Zowe SDK instead of its own unique package. So for V4, imperative may be going away. We'll give you a long lead time there before we actually make that change. So should have fair warning. But in V3, imperative will still be published to NPM as a separate package. Next, we have base profiles. And again, this is under consideration, but the functionality of base profiles can be more logically implemented using a nested team config structure. And given what we're doing with the multi API ML gateway support, it's maybe a bit messy to have multiple base profiles, a base API ML profile, an API profile. It gets complicated. If you use a nesting team config structure, I think it makes a lot more sense. Just logically looking at your team config, you have your LPAR, you have your properties for that LPAR, and you have your services. Base profiles are not really a necessity. But again, this is all planned for V4 if it happens at all. These are just potential deprecations that we're considering for V3. The functionality will remain in place in V3, just to clarify. Okay, moving on. So as far as V3 conformance changes, number one, with the removal of support for V1 profiles, plugins will only be able to support team configuration files. And the next one, if we choose to do something with the order of precedence for authentication, we'll probably be adding a conformance item for plugins that take more control over the over that process. And as far as testing plugins goes, we plan to release a pre-release version to NPM later this year that can be used for validating your plugins for V3. And so let's talk about a timeline. And again, there's no guarantees, no warranties. This is just a tentative timeline. And what we're looking at here is sometime around December, maybe earlier, but not much later than that. We intend to release the V3 pre-release to NPM. We'll have a branch available in our source repository. If you are feeling adventurous, I'm not sure how useful it will be though, so it might make more sense to wait for packages published to NPM. Between December and February, we'll be finalizing Zowe CLI for v3. And at the end of March, we will release Zowe CLI for v3 along with the rest of the Zowe v3 projects. So that is where we stand in terms of the timeline. In terms of resources, we'll be keeping the vNext page on zowe.org up to date with our planned changes for v3. So be sure to check that if you're interested in the latest information. And finally, contacts. So probably the fastest way for somebody to reach somebody on the CLI team would be to send us a message via the Zowe CLI or Zowe user Slack channel in the OMP Slack server. Of course, the Zowe CLI channel is probably the best channel. So if you have questions, reach out there. I'm sure somebody on the team will get back to you very, very quickly. For more complicated questions that you don't want to put in a public channel, feel free to email me at the email provided. We can discuss any questions you might have and try to find a solution if one is not available. Or at the very least, I can point you to a place to look. And finally, there's the GitHub repository. And you can open issues there. You can start discussions there. Really, for quick questions, the Zowe CLI chat channel or Slack channel is really the place to go. And with that, I will open it for questions.
Thanks, Adam. Anybody have any questions at this point? No question. With respect to conformance, Adam, I also want to mention that we will plan to publish at zowe.org/vnext what the conformance criteria will look like as compared to v2. We did this when we introduced v2, and I think folks found it useful, so we'll do the same for v2 and v3. So extenders and consumers, well, probably just extenders that will be interested, but extenders can see very clearly what the changes are with respect to the conformance criteria between v2 and v3. I think we're leaning towards most are going to be best practices if we introduce any, and shouldn't be tremendous impact on the extenders. I don't see anything in the chat either. Okay, then I guess with that, we can close out this week's office hours. Thanks again, Adam.